All right, everyone. It's time to begin our seventh session here at this very thought-provoking conference. I'm Johannes Matzert. I'm the host of this session. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Göttingen. In course of this session, we will see 4 fascinating presentations on the attitudes towards migration of host communities and the importance for integration. But before we start, I just want to remind you again that you can always post your questions in the chat. You can post them here on WebEx or in the chat on YouTube. Just to remind, if you want to ask a question via YouTube, you need to be logged into your account. With that being said, let's kick off the session with the first presentation on the reaction of natives to transit migration in terms of attitudes and entrepreneurship by Sergei Guryev. Sergei Guryev is a professor at Sciences Po in Paris, working on political economy and development. With that, Sergei, the floor is yours. I think we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
How much time would I have?
You have 20 to 25 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, that's good. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Indeed, that's a great conference, and I'm very honored to speak here. This is going to be a presentation of a joint paper with Nicholas Eisenman, who is now in São Paulo School of Economics, and Chewat Aksoy, who is a principal economist at the BRD, but also a invited professor, visiting professor at King's College London. This is a paper indeed on the attitudes of natives and how they're affected by transit migration. So this is going to be a paper about the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe. As you may know, we had a very important, unprecedented increase in asylum seekers in 2015-16. The Syrian conflict started before, but it was 2015 and 16 when the number of Syrian refugees, as well as refugees from other conflict-affected countries, really increased in Europe and increased substantially. And this will be this increase in 2015 that we are going to look at. And our paper is about the impact of this influx of refugees on countries in transit. So in principle, as you saw in this conference and generally in literature, we know a lot about the impact of mass migration on destination countries, also on sending countries, but this is one of the few papers which looks at transit countries. And of course, during the Syrian refugee crisis, a lot of countries in Europe were affected by the mass transit migration from Syria through Turkey, through Greece, and eventually to Germany and somewhat Italy. So just to visualize this picture, this is a journey that about 1 million refugees have taken through Middle East, Turkey, Greece, towards various cities in Germany. You see that my slides, are being changed, right? So you see the map now. Good. So one of the most important areas affected, even though this country is not going to be part of our sample, but there are papers which look at the impact of refugee migration on Greek elections, was of course Greek islands, where number of refugees exceeded number of natives by actually order of magnitude. And this is where people were talking about the lack of trust in law and order. For those of you who don't read the Greek alphabet, here is a quote from mayor of island of Lesbos, who writes in an open letter to the open letter to the Greek government. It says that we have a lot of irregular migrants and refugees, and we lose confidence in social order and in rule of law. So This is, by the way, from a paper which does show that influx of refugees had a political impact and helped an extreme right party to get much more votes than would have been expected otherwise. So our paper looks at transit countries, actually not Greece, but 18 other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which refugees have gone through on their way to Western European countries, first and foremost Germany. And so we ask a question: to what extent that affects native populations' confidence in political and legal institutions, change their attitudes to risks, propensity to take risks, and therefore pursue an economically meaningful entrepreneurial behavior. So this is one of the main results, just in one graph. So we will have two major outcome variables, self-reported attempt to start a business, and also current self-employment status, which is also a good proxy for entrepreneurship. And here you can see the difference in control and treated communities. So for us, the unit of observation will be locality, primary settling unit, a district in a city or a village or a small town. And so we'll have about 800 localities, and 200 of them were close to a transit migrant route, and we'll call them treated, and about 600 are far away. And so here you see, for example, the difference between control and treated localities on the left in terms of try to start business before and after the refugee crisis. Our survey will only look at 2010 and 2016, so before means 2010, after means 2016. And so here you see in the controlled locality, in controlled localities, there is no significant change. While in treated localities, there is a big decrease in entrepreneurship before and after. So if you're close to a migration, transit migration route, the level of entrepreneurship actually comes down a lot after the crisis. In terms of self-employment, there is decline in both control and treated, but the decline in control is much smaller than decline in treated, where it is actually quite substantial. So what we do, we find that if you are located close to a mass migration route, then the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis results in lower entrepreneurship. And when we try to investigate the mechanism, we find that that is due to decreased trust in institutions, increased sense of political instability, decreased confidence in rule of law and in political order, and decreased willingness to take risks. What we do rule out is we don't see aggregate economic shock. So when migrants pass by, that doesn't actually change unemployment, doesn't change local economic activity measured as satellite lights during nighttime. And we don't really see demographic changes due to selective outmigration. We don't see people who are more motivated, who are just leaving those places which are next to the localities which are affected by exposure to mass transit. So since I don't have much time, let me skip the literature. But basically, this is the first paper which looks at a multitude of countries, not just one country, and looks at mass transit migration and its impact on risk attitudes, confidence in institutions, and entrepreneurship. So, so for those of you who are in this conference, I probably don't need to remind you how Syrian refugee crisis developed. Basically, it was part of the Arab Spring, crackdown on protests, and already by March 2013, there was 1 million refugees. By the time I'm talking about, 1 million is the number which was on the way to Europe, but many more refugees actually were displaced to neighboring countries such as Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. So we are talking about 5 million or 6 million displaced cross-border and 6 more million internally displaced. So half of Syrian population has been displaced either to neighboring countries or Europe or internally. So it was a huge, huge crisis. Now, the route to Europe, There were multiple routes, but the main route, especially in 2015 and 16, was the route through Europe, through Turkey, to Greece, to Europe. It was only used by 12,000 people in 2013, 50,000 in 2014, but almost a million in 2015. And most of the refugees arriving to Western Europe in this period actually went through this Eastern Mediterranean route. We rely on data from International Organization of Migration. I'll say a few more words later on. But this was a big influx of refugees, and most of them have come through this Eastern Mediterranean route. As you can see, this is the one that we described. So which countries did they go to? So IOM ran what's called flow monitoring surveys. So they actually talked to refugees who made it to Europe and serving them in destination or transit countries. They actually found that most of the refugees wanted to go to Germany. The second largest destination was Italy. And then you have very few people who want to go to other Western countries. Now, we will focus on Germany and Italy as two top destinations, also because our countries, the 18 countries we look at, the Central and Eastern European countries, are countries which are closer to Germany and Italy rather than France. So what are the main data? So the data come from Life and Transition Survey, which is a World Bank EBRD survey of individuals in 35 Central Eastern post-communist, Central Eastern European post-communist countries. Actually, we are talking about 35 countries or so. We will focus on 18 transit countries. We will exclude, even though we do have data on Germany and Italy, we exclude Germany and Italy because these are destination countries, and therefore our exercise would be contaminated. Actually, when we include those countries, we will have similar results. But in the main exercise that I'm going to show you, it's going to be 18 countries, and there'll be a panel of localities. So the same localities are included in the survey in 2010 and in 2016. And so for us, the main regression will be to look at the attitudes within the same locality before and after, depending on the distance to the refugee route. And as for the routes, so we rely on IOM data, who provides us with information on which routes were used by refugees. Now, we know exactly the routes, but we don't know the intensity and timing of refugee flows along those routes. So we will only use geographical data. We don't really have intensity measures. So Life and Transition Survey, as I said, is 34, 35 countries, depending on which round. We have pre-crisis and after-crisis waves, 2010, 2016. And locality has, we have about 50 localities per country. And what is important, we will look at these 800 localities, which are the same in 2010 and 2016. And so for each locality, we'll measure distance to the refugee route. So the questions in the survey include demographics, but also attitudes, also economic variables such as labor market outcomes, wage, and entrepreneurial activity, and so on. So this is just a picture of localities in Leeds. As you can see, there are localities in Italy and localities in Germany, and there are localities in Turkey, but we will not use them because for us, what is going to be most important is 18 transit countries here. Okay. So we will focus on distance to refugee routes in Eastern Mediterranean route. This is what our data cover. And as a measure of exposure to refugee route, we will use the distance from locality to the route, to the closest refugee route, and we'll take a minus log. So minus log distance means that the larger this variable, the closer you are to the refugee route. And so this is a good measure of exposure to mass transit migration. So other things we control for, individual characteristics such as age, gender, education, married status, and so on. We also control for country year fixed effect. And then we control for locality fixed effect and year fixed effect. We have 2 years, 2010 and 2016. And we have, as I said, 800 localities. So that's what we do. So we also use an instrument. So in those studies, instrumentation is important because the location of routes may be endogenous to attitudes of the natives. And that's always an issue in studies of political implications of migration, including refugee migration. And so this is why we need to instrument the exposure to mass transit migration through a geographical instrument. The way we do it, and this is what's been done by other people, we calculate the distance to the optimal route. So suppose we know that a person is traveling from Damascus to Berlin, and you are somewhere in a location in Romania. So what we do, we say, how about this person calculates the optimal travel route, and then I'll calculate the distance from my village in Romania to the optimal route. And then I use this distance to the optimal route as an instrument to the actual distance to the route. So this is a common measure of common optimal geographic instrument. So suppose you are in this Romanian town, so the actual distance is this light gray line, and the black line here is actually the optimum travel route to the optimal route from Damascus to Berlin. And so we have three origins for Kabul, Baghdad, and Damascus, and two destinations, Berlin and Rome. And this is just zoomed in picture of the instrument from San Pietro di Cante. You see the actual distance, light gray, and the minimum walking distance is alongside this route. Okay, so that's what we do. We calculate this instrument, and so we basically assume that this thing is predicting the optimal routes, predict actual routes, which they do. And our argument is that this is an exogenous geographical variable which should not affect economic or attitudinal outcomes. Now, of course, the optimal routes may be related to commercially dense areas, trade routes, and so on. And so in order to fix that, we control for distance to all main highways. There may be other highways which are not related to routes from Berlin to Damascus. We also control for distance to main railroads, and we also use those as placebo, and we show that distance to main highways or distance to main railroads doesn't have an impact. So once we run this first stage estimation, we do find strong correlation, and we do find very strong F statistics. Even when you control for locality and near fixed effect, there's a very strong correlation. And even when you include country by year fixed effect, the correlation stops being 1, but it's 0.7 plus minus 16. So it's not bad at all. And this is the same thing presented graphically, where we use the instrument and show the actual outcome. They're very highly correlated. Now, the main result is that exposure to transit route affects the variable, which is I try to set up a business, and the variable, which is I'm self-employed now. In both cases, we have a major impact, 2 percentage points for first variable, and the average level of that variable is like 12%, and 1 percentage point for the second variable, and average value of this variable is like 1%. And the effect is concentrated, while we look at the continuous variable distance, the effect is actually concentrated in the vicinity of 25 kilometers. Once we start to look at what happens once you're beyond 25 kilometers, the effect goes down in magnitude and stops being significant. So if you take a dummy for being closer than 15 kilometers, the effect would be significant, 25 kilometers as well, but once you go beyond 25 kilometers, exposure doesn't matter anymore. So in the IV regressions, the effect is even stronger. We attribute that to measurement error, but in general, we do find the effect in instrumental variable regressions is twice as strong as in OLS regressions. So the question is why, to what extent it is linked to migrants or not. One of the things we do, we look at data from leads where people say how they treat migrants, whether migrants make available contribution to the economy or migrants are a burden. And then we also use another question, which is a common question in those studies, which is, would you mind having migrants as a neighbor? Or would you mind to have a homosexual as a neighbor, or people with kids as a neighbor? And so we find that exposure to refugee routes really reduces likelihood that people like migrants, but doesn't affect attitudes to other groups. So these are the coefficients from IV regressions for migrants and other groups. So you see, people are more likely to say that if people are closer to a refugee route, there is an increase in likelihood to say that migrants are a burden for the national social protection system. And then I don't like having migrants as neighbors. And 8 percentage points change between 2010 and 2015. And then when you look at things like homosexuals, different race, Roma, there is no change. People don't like foreigners after being exposed to forced transit migration, but it's really foreigners, not foreign investors, for example, which suggests it's still about refugees rather than foreigners in general. So we also run pre-trans. There was another round in the survey in 2006. So for those localities which were included both in 2006 and 2010, we're able to check for pre-trans, and there are no pre-trans before 2010. So about potential mechanisms, as I said, what we look at, and I've been talking for 20 minutes, I'll be wrapping up in 5 minutes. It's probably 2 minutes, just to leave 5 minutes for questions. So basically, we use other outcomes such as risk attitudes and changes in interpersonal trust, local economic activities, confidence in institutions, and so on. And basically, we find that exposure to transit migration reduces trust in national government, reduces trust in regional government, reduces trust in local government, doesn't affect trust in the army, reduces likelihood to say that you have peace, stability, law, and order, reduces satisfaction with political situation, doesn't have any impact on the economic situation. So it's really undermining confidence in political and legal institutions. No impact on life satisfaction, job satisfaction, financial satisfaction, optimism, but a strong impact on willingness to take risks. No impact on trust in other people or confidence that lost wallet will be returned if you lose the wallet. So it's not like distrusting other people. It's not like being unhappier, but more like being less confident in political institutions, law and order, stability, and that makes people more risk averse, and that results in lower entrepreneurial activity. Now, when we look at economic activity such as luminosity, we find no effect. Coefficients are insignificant. When we look at where people go when they become less self-employed, we see that people move out of labor force. There is a negative impact on unemployed, but small and insignificant. Negative impact on wage employment, small and insignificant. But people really stop being entrepreneurs and instead move out of labor force. So when we look at out-migration, to what extent exposure to forced routes results in greater disproportional changes in social demographic characteristics, we find no results. So I already mentioned placebo in terms of distance to main roads and main railroads, and we find no results, as I mentioned. We run additional robustness checks, such as subnational region by year fixed effects, find nothing. Use different clustering, exclude various countries and find nothing, and also look for heterogeneity. Don't really find much in terms of heterogeneity. So let me conclude. Once again, this is a first multi-country analysis of the impact of mass refugee flows on transit countries, on 18 transit countries. So what we find is we document large negative effects of exposure to such transit migration on natives' entrepreneurial activity. Once we try to understand the mechanism, we find the evidence that people are less likely to like migrants, less likely to believe that political institutions work well, reduced confidence in stability and law and order, are less likely to take risks, and that all paints a very consistent picture where what we find suggests that this was a very badly managed refugee crisis, which did create a lot of dissatisfaction in political and legal institutions, which in turn reduce entrepreneurial activity by the locals. So we roll out alternative explanations, which I already mentioned. And in that sense, let me stop here, and we still have 3 minutes for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting presentation. And I find the focus on transit countries specifically fascinating. I don't see any question in the chat yet, so I want to encourage everyone to post the questions in the chat. Maybe in the meantime,
there is a question in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, okay, I'm trying to see it. Yeah. How much time did the study consider in the transit country? Are migrants entirely burdened to those countries? Are they not serving as a market for local economies for transit countries? Any social cohesion between the groups? So mostly these migrants would spend several weeks, because most of them actually walked through the country. And some countries are small, so you can walk through a country in a week. But in most countries, they would spend a month or so. To what extent they created local economic demand? The answer is we don't see that. We look at local economic activity and we don't see that. In principle, you can imagine that there is a negative impact because of reduced entrepreneurial activity, but there is also a positive impact because migrants spend some money, and also national governments and European institutions send money to provide support to the migrant. But so this positive and negative impacts on local economy apparently balance each other, so we don't find any net economic impact. And this is exactly the difference. The question is, are they serving for looking at the local economy as a market in transit countries? So that's exactly the difference between transit countries and destination countries. In destination countries where migrants settle, they engage in economic activity with the locals. That creates compassion, empathy, cooperation, and that's what contact hypothesis by Gordon Allport suggests. So if you have repeated interaction between minority and majority groups, which is based on equal standing, mutually beneficial cooperation, then empathy may emerge and stereotypes may be reduced. But in transit countries, these conditions are not satisfied. People just move through, and you see that there is no order in that. You see piles of garbage after a bus with migrants passes by, or a crowd of migrants walks by, and so you think that your government is not really doing a great job.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I think with that, we are perfectly in time to move on to our next presentation. So thank you very much again, Sergey Yuryev. Our next presentation will be on the importance of economic conditions and immigration attitudes for the integration of refugees in Germany. And the project will be presented to us by Zevat Aksoy, who is an assistant professor at King's College London and principal economist in the office of the chief economist at the EBRD. Chair, the floor is yours.
You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me start my timer. Okay, perfect. Hi everyone. First of all, many thanks to organizers for accepting our paper in the program. So this paper is about how initial conditions at the time of arrival shape multidimensional integration of refugees. And to be able to answer this question, what we do, we use basically data from Germany and also variation generated by the German settlement policy. And this is what this paper is about. So, as Sergei showed in his presentation, we know that number of refugees in Europe, particularly in Germany, has increased drastically over the last few years, especially right after 2013. But the one issue is that refugees typically arrive in a host country with worse language skills and also less locally applicable human capital than economic migrants. We know that economic migrants are positively self-selected with respect to education as well as language skills, but that's not the case for refugees. Refugees, as we know, tend to go to the countries there is no war, and then they can the countries that can process their asylum applications. So, but in the long term, this has implications for their integration because they are more likely to start at significantly lower levels of wages and employability. And at the same time, initial conditions at the time of arrival matter for successful integration. And then so far in the literature, 3 papers actually have been shown that this has, initial conditions, have long-lasting effects for refugees and economic migrants. So in this paper, what we do is the following. First, we provide the first systematic evidence on how initial local unemployment, as well as attitudes towards immigrants, shape the integration of refugees. So far, what we realize in the literature is that attitudes towards migrants when it comes to shaping up refugees' integration outcomes have not been studied. So that's something we bring in this paper, and then we show that actually economic attitudes towards immigrants are as important as economic conditions when it comes to shaping up refugees' integration process. We focus on refugees who arrived in Germany between 2013 and 2016 and surveyed in SOEF survey of refugees, which is the largest representative survey of refugees in Europe. As I said at the beginning, our identification relies on the exogenous placement of refugees upon arrival and the fact that they were not free to choose their initial place of residence. And I will show you some quantitative evidence to convince you that this initial allocation of refugees or the settlement policy is likely to generate some random variation. What we also do, we measure attitudes towards immigrants in 2 different ways, but both measures deliver qualitatively similar results. First thing, county-level attitudes measure is not available in Germany. So we get around this problem by using geocoded tweets and then creating a sentiment index for each county in Germany. In addition to that, what we use, we basically proxy attitudes by using far-right vote shares from 2017 and 2013 local and general elections. And then we show that both measures deliver, again, similar results. In this paper, we not only focus on economic integration of refugees, but we also look at multidimensional integration of refugees. That's something we, again, do. And then given that we work with individual level data, we can actually check the integration outcomes separately by gender. So what do we find? So we find that refugees assigned to countries with high unemployment rates or unwelcoming attitudes are less likely to be in employment or education, and less likely to be in full or part-time employment. High unemployment and negative attitudes towards immigrants also have a strong negative impact on the refugees' net monthly earnings and also on the multidimensional integration index. Again, in this paper, we are interested in sort of this horse-race relationship between local economic conditions, which we proxy by local unemployment rates, and also the attitudes towards immigrants. And then, as I said a few minutes ago, both measures seem to be important, or put differently, attitudes towards immigrants are as important as local economic conditions when it comes to refugees integration. We also do some back-of-the-envelope calculation to understand public finance benefits or public finance implications. We find that allocating 100,000 randomly selected working-age refugees to counties with 1 standard deviation lower unemployment rate or better attitudes would generate annual public finance benefits of 46 to 49 million euros. Depending on the measure we use, this basically public finance benefits vary between 21 to 48 million euros when it comes to attitudes measure. Our paper is related to three different strands of the literature. The first one is, as I said, initial economic conditions and how they shape up refugees integration. We contribute to that literature directly. And then there's a second strand of the literature which basically looks at, which basically compares labor market outcomes between refugees and other migrants. And several papers basically study other factors that affect refugees integration. This includes ethnic networks, job search assistance, employment bans at arrival, restructuring integration programs, and so on. So I will spend a few minutes trying to explain how refugee settlement policy works in Germany. So the distribution of refugees across Germany follows an established two-step process. So once refugees are registered in Germany, they are distributed across states first. And this dispersal of refugees is based on predefined allocation scheme, which is called the Koenigsegg. So the Koenigsegg determines what share of refugees is received by each state based on the state's tax revenues and population sizes. And the German government basically updates the Koenigsegg and the related shares on an annual basis. Once refugees are allocated across states, then states allocate refugees across counties. And this is basically based on relative population shares. It's very intuitive. More populated countries receive more refugees. This is basically the idea. So we can actually quantitatively check this. What we do here, at the county year level, on the left-hand side, I have refugee inflows. On the right-hand side, I have several covariates, such as population size of the county, unemployment rate, population density of the county, GDP per capita, average age, housing availability, share of tertiary education. And we focus on within state variation. And then so we have state mix effects. So what we find in this table is that population size is the only statistically significant predictor of the number of asylum seekers assigned per county. And this is in line with what we see in the regulation. And we in each column we basically report results for separate years. But when we pull these years and then also include year mixed effects, we find similar results that population size is the only covariate that consistently matter for refugees dispersal. But of course, this table doesn't say anything about refugees' characteristics, but it only shows that population size is a significant predictor for the number of asylum seekers assigned to different countries. So what happens once refugees are assigned to countries? The first thing is refugees' mobility is severely restricted for at least 3 years. And this is based on law, which is called Integration Act, which was legislated in July 2016. And to enforce this restriction, refugees who do not comply with the regulation lose basic entitlement to social benefits. Why this is important? Because still about 60% of refugees in Germany are not in employment or education. That means that they basically heavily rely on social benefits. So once they move to a different country, they directly lose these social benefits. So there are a lot of reasons for refugees to stay in their initially assigned country. And of course, in some states, conditional on the approval of immigration authorities, refugees are allowed to move to a different country. We don't have direct data on this, or we don't have good data on this, but we know that from the reports, German NGOs, these permits are granted only in exceptional circumstances. The main reason will be the family reunification. And then looking at the raw data, we find that only about 8% of refugees move to another state from their initially assigned state. So movements across states, at least, seem to be very low. And then another recent paper which also shows that allocation of refugees is rarely linked to individual wishes, economic prospects, or cultural proximity. So settlement policy has three features that are very important to us. First thing is exogenous allocation. They are allocated by the state to different counties. And then once they're allocated across different counties, their mobility is restricted. And then both states and counties, and also refugees, must participate in the allocation program. And then these three features are crucial for our identification strategy as they generate a plausibly random allocation of refugees counties. I will provide you more direct quantitative evidence on this, basically balance table, in a few slides. So our data set, we use data from, as I said, SWAP, which basically provides a representative survey of refugees who arrived in Germany after 2013. And we focus on economically active individuals aged 18 to 49. Our results get actually even stronger when we look at the working age population 18 to 64. We have four main outcome variables. Dummy variable for being in employment or education. Dummy variable for being in full-time or part-time employment. We use as another outcome variable monthly net wages. And then we basically construct a multidimensional integration index based on Harder et al.'s Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences paper, which got published in 2018. So, as I said, county-level attitudes towards immigrants measure is not available in Germany. We basically use Twitter data, geolocated or geocoded Twitter data in Germany in 2014 to construct our novel county-level attitudes measure. What we do, we first identify geolocated tweets that includes words and hashtags related to migrants and migration. And then we basically keep tweets that are in German and or English. And then using these tweets, what we do, we conduct sentiment analysis and we build two alternative measures, negative sentiment index and polarity index, both of which actually deliver similar results. This basically shows us the geolocation of tweets in Germany. Overall, we identify more than 150,000 tweets that we can actually use for our analysis. These maps is to show distribution of county-level treatment variables. Again, in main tables, we focus on local unemployment rate and negative sentiment index, both measured in 2014. And we also use far-right vote shares from 2017 and also 2013 local and general elections. So let's look at refugees' main activity in Germany. I think that the key thing is here, about 60% of refugees are not in employment or training or in education. And this figure basically goes down to only 56% after 5 years, after spending 5 years in Germany. When we look at by gender, panel A shows the stats for males, and the panel B shows the stats for females. Inactivity there is even higher for women, which is about 76%, and then for men, it is about 50%. So again, even after 5 years, most refugees, working age refugees or economically active refugees, stay inactive in Germany. So let's look at our identification strategy. So again, our identification strategy explores the German refugee settlement policy as a quasi-natural experiment. On the left-hand side, we have the outcomes I just mentioned. On the right-hand side, we have two treatment variables that are measured in 2014 at the county level. These are unemployment rate and local attitudes towards immigrants. And again, we are interested in this horse-race relationship between the two to understand which dimension is more important. We control for several individual covariates. We have here FixFX. And then given that our treatment variables are measured at the county level, we can't control for county, we can't include county FixFX, but what we can do, we can go one level higher, and then we can include NUTS to sub-region FixFX. We cluster standard errors at the county level. We also correct for spatial correlation following common. And then we also report bootstrap standard errors at the state level, and then our results actually remain significant. You may also worry that initial unemployment rate and the negative sentiment index may co-move. The correlation may be too high between the two. We check for this. It is pretty low. It's 38.38. And then the row correlation between initial unemployment rate and the far right void share is even lower. It is about 0.19. So this is our balance table basically. Our identification assumption is that unemployment rates and attitudes towards migrants are uncorrelated with refugees' individual level characteristics. And again, we can quantitatively check this. We have 6 different panels here. The first 2 panel outcome variable is unemployment rate in 2014. Third panel, third and the fourth columns, actually, the outcome variable is negative sentiment index, and 5th and 6th columns, outcome variables are far right vote shares. Here, in the first panel, we basically focus on refugees in the first 2 years, and then in panel B, we basically focus on the full sample. Here, we have refugees' demographic characteristics, such as age, gender dummy, education, and then their language skills. And then we have several, and in column 1, 3, and 5, we don't include statistics effects. In columns 2, 4, and 6, we include statistics effects. And what we see here is that indeed low unemployment rates and attitudes towards migrants are uncorrelated with refugees' individual level characteristics, which suggests that there's little political. For example, you can't. This table suggests that actually there's little political influence going on in the sense that maybe some states may send some educated refugees to different type of counties. So this doesn't seem to be the case according to this table. So if you believe in our identification assumption, I can also show you the main results. So here we basically throughout the paper we always report standardized coefficients, so that we can actually compare the point estimates on our 2 different variables, local unemployment rate and negative sentiment index. What we find is that intuitively higher unemployment rate and negative sentiment index has both of them actually has negative impact on refugees integration. And when it comes to magnitudes, the magnitudes are actually fairly similar. In this table, we basically unbundle the effects on multidimensional integration index, which we report in column here. Once we unbundle the multidimensional integration index, we find that the effects are driven by economic integration and also social integration. We can also check our robustness of our results using far right vote share instead of Twitter measure, which has its own advantages but also disadvantages. Our results again are qualitatively similar when we use far right vote share in 2007. Of course, this could be an endogenous measure because we used the measure in 2017. But we also show that there's little correlation, as I showed you in the balance table. There's almost no correlation between refugees' individual characteristics and far right vote share in 2017. The effects are basically mainly driven by the male sample when we look at by gender. When we look at the fiscal implication of our results, as I said, this could basically generate better allocation scheme could generate at a minimum an annual gain of about 50 million euros to the public sector. We do a lot of robustness checks. We also use election results from the 2013 elections. We find qualitatively similar results. We run the Oster's unit variable bias test. It doesn't seem like our results are driven by some unit variables. We also include sub-region by year fixed effects. Our results remain similar. We conduct multiple hypothesis tests because we have 4 different outcomes. Our results remain similar, again, significant. We also check robustness to alternative legs of unemployment rate at county level. We also look at robustness to analyzing only states with strict restrictions on residency. We run logistic regressions. We drop potentially bad controls. Our results remain similar. We also look at alternative age. As I said, age 18 to 64. Our results get even stronger, actually. We drop counties with few refugees. We try alternative levels of clustering. We also report bootstrap standard errors clustered at the state level. And again, our results go through against all these robustness checks. The conclusion is that our results highlight the importance of initial conditions for refugee integration. And then we find that local attitudes towards immigrants are actually are important as local unemployment rate or local economic conditions. And we think that our findings have important implications for the design of refugee allocation policies. For example, Germany could improve refugee integration outcomes by changing the distribution mechanism such that it could incorporate the integration capacity of states, such as unfilled job vacancies. And at the European level, warning against proposals to reallocate refugees into, according to our results, there's a warning against proposals to reallocate refugees into unwelcoming attitudes, unwelcoming countries, sorry. And with that, I will conclude, and then I would like to see whether there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk on the big question of refugee integration. There are two comments in the chat. The one was asked during your presentation, and Sean Hong wondered to which extent a Twitter-based measure is representative, especially in the context of Germany.
So that is a fair question, and that's a good point. So that's why we basically check the robustness of our results using alternative measures, which is basically the vote shares for right-wing parties in 2013 and 2017, and the results are qualitatively similar. And of course, Twitter data has its advantages because it gives us, and it is at the county level we can identify tweets, the geolocation of tweets. But its disadvantage is that there's self-selection into tweeting, but not only that, but there's also self-selection into activating the geolocation feature of Twitter. But when used alternative measure, our results are similar. And Thomas has a question as well. Okay. I wasn't aware of this paper actually. That's from the immigration lab. I will take a look at it, Thomas. Thank you.
Yes, so maybe just in relation to that comment, so would you advise to adapt basically the refugee allocation mechanism then in Germany to take attitudes and economic conditions into account, or do you expect they're more like?
I think our results kind of make a very clear point in that direction, but I think politically that wouldn't be realistic. And when we do this backup envelope allocations, actually these are lower bound estimates, but annual benefits to the public finance is relatively huge. But again, I think politically that's not very likely to happen.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Have like 2-3 more minutes. I think
Let's move to the.
Yes, if not, I think I would suggest to move on. So thank you very much for this very insightful and interesting presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
And so next on would be Ji-Yeon Hong presenting on, again, a presentation on refugee attitudes and specifically whether the experience of war in the past affects the host community's attitude, reaction to refugee inflows in the setting of South Korea. And Ji-Yeon Hong is an assistant professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? And then, am I showing my slide well? Okay. All right. Let me just make it a full screen. Good. Uh-oh. Is it full screen now or?
No.
No, okay. Let me just do this. Okay. Thanks for a nice introduction. I'm very honored to actually present this paper with a lot of other interesting papers by great scholars. So again, this paper might be a little refreshment because it's the context is South Korea, which often the refugee studies haven't studied much. So hope that refreshes you too. This is a co-authored work with Cecilia Mo at Berkeley and also Christopher Pegg at NYU Abu Dhabi. All right, so okay, sorry about the technological. How can usually it's quite late here, so I'm presenting from my home, and this is kind of unusual setting for me. So again, very sorry for the but can you see the slides well? Then okay. I don't have to re-emphasize that to this group of people, but refugee crisis has been a global issue, and it's increasingly difficult and very hard to fix. But as all the presentations for the past few days and today have shown, the burden has been carried by a few advanced economy, especially Germany or Turkey. Very few countries have been taking a lot of burden. So, and then the other countries, although they are sort of economically advanced and have very good institutions and human rights perception, many countries have been kind of set back and didn't engage much in the refugee crisis. And obviously, South Korea is one of those countries. And alarming pattern we have been seeing in South Korea, but to some extent also in Japan and China as well, is that although they have accepted very, very few refugees, the anti-refugee sentiment is also very large there. So our research question we have in this project is what kind of strategies can reduce those anti-refugee sentiment in the context where in the countries where they haven't accepted many refugees actually or asylum seekers. And in the context of Korea, about 70 years ago, about 2 to 3 generations before, it had a very large civil war, which killed millions of people, the Korean War. So whether you or your family had a past experience of war, does it affect your openness to the refugees today? So that's the overall research question. We're not the first one, of course, maybe on Korean context, yes, but there are other scholars have studied similar research questions. So I think the closest one is by Dinas and Fuka, which was published at Journal of Politics recently. They asked similar question in the context of Greece. So they found people have family members who had a war experience have more sympathetic or empathetic attitude toward the refugees today. And also another paper by Dida et al. They did perspective taking exercise. So they asked people to think about the asylum seekers situation, and if you were in the situation, what do you think is the most difficult thing you will face, etc. So those kind of perspective taking exercise, does that make people more sympathetic to refugees? On the other hand, some other scholars argue that giving accurate information about refugees and refugee taking might help people have reduce their threat concept and be more acceptable of accepting about refugees. In the context of South Korea, as I briefly mentioned, it has been overall very detached from refugee crisis, global refugee crisis. But in 2018, there was a event which I'm going to describe a little more in detail soon. There was an event that aroused a lot of salience of this issue in South Korea. And another context is that as I mentioned before, the country had experienced a massive civil war about 7 decades ago, and a lot of and then that event had been sort of one of the dominant factor in the politics of South Korea ever since. So the tension, the war itself hasn't been practically ended, so it's still in armistice status, and the North Korean threat is always there. So those political circumstances of Korea have always reminded people of war and then the Korean War experience. So some historians describe that the Korean War never ended and pretty much is ongoing in people's mind in Korea. And so, but the war experience itself might be a little different from individual to individual. So some families may have their ancestors dead because of North Korean attack or killings by the South Korean government. And what the specific war experience that we are focusing on in this paper is the kind of forced displacement by North Korean regime, those people who had to move to South Korea because of the persecution by the communist regime at the time. So these are many of landlords, families, or Christian families. Those were basically persecuted massively in the northern part of the territory, and then they had to move to South Korea, southern part of the territory during the just before or during the Korean War, and they were never be able to go back to their hometown. In Korean, they are called 실향민, which literally means who lost their hometown. So these are one of the groups that we are trying to look at in this experimental in this survey experiment study. Okay, so the overall refugee acceptance in South Korea is quite recent, and also very, very, in terms of number, it's very few. So there were about 40,000 applicants, asylum seekers, and only 2% of them, so about 830 people, have been accepted as refugee for the past 3 decades. And although Korea accepted all the international laws related to refugees, the overall acceptance rate by the government is like one of the lowest in the world. And then what happened in 2018 was there were about 500 Yemenis refugees who were in Malaysia at the time, using the visa waiver policy, which as the sort of window, and then they flew to a small tourist island in Korea called Jeju Island. And then this alerted the citizens and the government a lot. So the government revoked the visa waiver to Yemeni citizens right away. But still, these 500 Yemenis who arrived in Jeju Island were a huge political, were in huge political debate at the time. Very quickly, there were a series of protests or demonstrations by people who are against the refugees, accepting the refugee in Korea. And then they were also countered by a much smaller size but pro-refugee protest. And there is a petition site for, like, very similar to the White House petition site for the presidential office, to the presidential office. And there were a petition against the refugee, which I translated the title here. And then this has been, this petition was supported by 700,000 people, South Korean citizens, and then this was among the most supported petition in the history of this petition website. So you can see the refugee issue became very salient in the country, and then also a lot of people, more people were against accepting refugees rather than being sympathetic or supporting the acceptance. However, historically, South Korea used to be the origin of refugees. The Korean War left a lot of refugees, mostly domestic refugees, during the wartime, and even after the war, a lot of war orphans had to they basically moved to U.S. or European countries to find new families. So our survey design sort of used this unique setup of the country, and then reminding the respondents or subjects about the refugee history that we had, the country had in 70 years ago. How does that affect their attitude? Okay. So we conduct a survey experiment asking the shared experience, the similar experience that the respondent's family had, as well, not just war experience, but also the displacement experience. And how does that affect the attitude of the attitude toward the refugees today, and then the government policy? And then we also we also test whether the providing information would change the attitude. So we provide two different types of information. One is how South Korea underperformed in terms of refugee crisis, reacting to refugee crisis compared to other advanced countries. And the other was the economic cost that a lot of people are worried about. So actually, we use a actual study published in Science Advance that refugee in the long run is not economically costly to the society. So Okay, so we took online survey experiment, which was conducted in April of 2019. We used the largest survey farm in the country. With the subjects were 2,000 respondents. We used the region, age, and gender quota. And we have 4 different vignettes. 3 vignettes and 1 control group, and then each group was divided into 2, and then one group did perspective taking exercise, and the other half didn't. So in conclusion, there are 8 groups, 3 different vignettes, and perspective taking or not. And vignettes, as I explained, one is emphasizing the shared experience of war between South Korea and the today's refugee, and the other is providing economic information that the taking refugee does not burden the country too much, and then finally the relative performance of Korea in refugee acceptance. So sorry. As I mentioned before, overall, it's confirmed from our survey respondents that overall people are against taking refugees. So we asked the entire respondents whether do you think the number of refugees from foreign countries, it's actually a separate question. There's one question about immigrants, there's another question about refugees. So do you think refugees from foreign countries permitted to stay in Korea should increase or decrease? And then as you see here, most of the people support decrease or stay the same. And then refugees are viewed as a threat to the country's culture or the safety or even national security. So the overall view about refugee among South Korean population is quite negative, as you see. And then there is a religious elements as well. So we don't have it here, but when we see by group, the Christian respondents are more against the refugees, to see refugees as from a religious perspective more strongly. And then females have stronger anti-refugee sentiments as well. So these are our vignettes. So the first shared experience vignette basically emphasized what's happening to refugees today is very similar to what happened to Korea. And we also mentioned that Korea had a lot of help from foreign countries and to arouse more empathy toward today's refugees. And Koreans are overall very sensitive about like comparing the country to other countries. So our first information vignette is about like how little Korea is doing compared to other OECD, other advanced countries around the world about the refugee crisis. And this was our vignette. And then the final information vignette is about economic information that taking refugees are actually can be helpful for the long-term growth of the economy. That's the last one, and then there is a control group didn't get any messages. And then each of these groups were divided into 2 groups, and then one group take a perspective taking exercise where we ask questions, what would you take? Would you, if you have to leave the country as a refugee, and then where would you like to go or and stay? And then what do you think will be your biggest challenge if you become a refugee leaving the country? And then the final element that we use in analysis is after doing all the experiments and then after asking all the questions about individual traits, we ask almost at the end of the survey, we ask whether you yourself experienced the war or your family member, direct family member, parents, siblings, or grandparents were victimized by the Korean War. So this is a war experience question, and we have information about the hometown of the respondent. So you can if your family is from North Korea, the territory that belongs to North Korea today, there's a question that asks you or your parents where their hometown, where they were born. We use this question as a measure for the displaced population from North Korea. Okay. I'll given the time. So we first let me show you whether our vignettes worked. So we conduct a couple of manipulation check. As you see here, the shared experience, the message overall. Then the question that we use to check whether the manipulation worked is the question whether do you think Korea suffered more than other countries historically, and then the group that got the shared experience message that compares Korea's experience with the current refugees experience overall have lower less likely to answer yes to this question. Okay, for the underperformance underperformance vignette, we use the question that we asked do you know how many asylum seekers Korea accepted historically? We added this question as a knowledge check question, and the accuracy when the group that was treated with the vignette that emphasized the underperformance of the country. So vast majority of people overestimated the Koreans' acceptance rate. They think Korea accepted like 20%, 50%. Many of them answered that way, but these group that were treated with the underperformance message have much higher accuracy in terms of the Korea's historical acceptance rate of asylum seekers. And finally, the economic information. When there's a question about whether you think refugees can help the economy in the long run, and the group that got the economic information vignette have a much higher probability of saying yes to this question as well. All right, so our results are sort of summarized in these two figures. Overall, the messages, the treatment work quite well, but the shared experience message, the sympathy treatment, we call it sympathy treatment in the paper, was most effective. And if we look at the group who experienced the Korean War and then who were displaced by the war, they were the group who experienced Korean War were actually more negative toward refugees, and the group who were displaced by from the North Korean territory were more. It's not significant here, but more have more positive attitude toward refugees. So to clarify, among 2,000 people, 2,000 respondents, about 50% of the respondents say yes to the war experience. So either you or your family were victimized by the Korean War. So that's 50%. And then the share of the population who moved from North Korea, who were displaced from North Korea, was about 5% of the entire respondents. Okay, so this is much smaller group to compare to this one, and this group is actually the displacement group is actually part of the overall war experience group. So all the people who were who moved from North Korea said yes to the war experience question, which makes sense. And when we subdivided these treatment into different subgroups, so the first is overall treatment effect, and then the second one is interaction with the war experience. So about 50% of the survey, the respondents. And then the final set of results is by the interacted with the displaced respondents, who North Korean defectors in an easier term, historical North Korean defectors. And as you see, overall, the effect is positive, but what's clearly show is that the shared experience message have a more significant effect among the displaced group. So when you or your family had an experience of forced displacement from North Korea, and then the shared experience message works really effectively. Overall, but it's not as the effect is not as strong among the group which just experienced the Korean War. And what we also found was the perspective taking, unlike the Adida et al. Paper, was not very effective, did not have any significant effect in our overall study. And then in the paper, we discussed the reason in a quite long length. All right. So, and then we delve into some of the causal mechanisms that can possibly explain the results, which for the sake of time, I'll skip. So in conclusion, we find that South Koreans are in general against the refugees settling down in the country, and then the baseline acceptance of baseline levels of refugee acceptance among those people who indicated their family had a war experience is even lower than the general population who doesn't have any link to the war experience. However, we found the types of war experience matters. So when your war experience include forced displacement, we find they are overall much more open-minded to refugees or taking refugees during this global crisis. At the same time, they are more effectively affected by the sympathetic messages that link the refugees today to their own historical experience and family experience. Thank you so much. And I'm very sorry again about the technical glitch.
Thank you very much for this very insightful perspective on refugee attitudes. Maybe in the meantime, so there's only a pointer in the chat, which you can read later to another paper.
Okay.
Since there's no other question, maybe one from my side in the meantime. To which extent do you think the South Korean setting is special, or do you think like your findings would translate well to another setting like Africa or so, where a large share of the population has experience with past like war and displacement?
I think that's a very good and important question. I think the specialty of South Korea is economically, at least, it's ready and then capable of helping a lot of refugees. But it's but the barrier has been the cultural issue, because a lot of crisis the refugee crisis is happening in countries far away from the country, and then it's culturally very different population. So what we have focused, that might be different context from Africa. So in the study, like what we focused on is how to make a sort of link, like sympathy link or empathy link between the Korean population and then the current refugees today, as the sort of based on human rights, based on general universal rights, etc. But other war experience contexts, I think that's definitely applicable to other civil war torn countries. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Right. Maybe like 1 minute left. Let's see if another question pops up. Yes.
Thanks for suggesting papers. I'll on the chat box, we'll definitely cite these papers. Yeah.
Great, nice, perfect. Yes, then thank you again very much for your talk. I will then hand over to the next presentation, which is on aid, and especially how we can use aid to affect attitudes towards refugees in host communities in Uganda. And it will be presented to us by Olivia Werdemikay and Thomas Jin. Olivia is a PhD candidate at Harvard University, and Thomas is a research fellow at the Center for Global Development. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Does this work?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm presenting our paper, Can Aid Change Attitudes Towards Refugees? Experimental Evidence from Uganda. And this is a co-authored project with Travis Bosler, who's also here and in the chat to answer any questions, Thomas Ginn, who's going to be co-presenting with me, Robert Hakiza, Didi Ogude as well. And so before starting off, I want to say thanks to everyone here, and thanks to those who funded our project, FCDO, the World Bank, UNHCR, and Innovations for Poverty Action, and also issued the disclaimer that this work doesn't necessarily represent their views. So our project is motivated by this idea that there are policies that can raise aggregate welfare, but might create winners and losers, so they might not be politically feasible to implement. And even if some of these gains could be redistributed to compensate the losers, that still might not persuade them to support such a policy. Giving refugees the right to work is an example of this problem. And the Global Compact on Refugees encapsulates this bargain, in which host governments and host communities grant refugees inclusive rights, such as allowing labor market access, and in return, they receive a portion of the aid to relieve part of the pressures of hosting. And even in the short term, receiving this aid, and the long-term benefits of incorporating refugees into the labor market might still not be enough to persuade citizens who often hold anti-refugee or anti-immigrant attitudes to grant refugees these rights. And so we take as our starting point that aid could be a potential lever to influence host attitudes. And we know that when host communities are excluded from programs and benefits for refugees, this can negatively affect their support for refugees and create jealousies and resentment. We also know that there are many programs that already exist that target refugees and the host communities, but might not make these messages or these links with refugees explicit for the recipients. While we believe aid could be used to positively influence attitudes, it could also be the case that making this link more explicit might crowd out some of the altruistic motivations for hosting, or even backfire, as host citizens might see refugee hosting contingent on continued aid. So our project today asks the question, does connecting aid to hosts with refugee presence and hosting shift host community attitudes? And in order to test this question, we designed an RCT with small business owners in Kampala, Uganda. We have 3 treatment arms and a control group. So the first treatment is a cash grant of $140, so that's equivalent to about 3 months of profit. The second is a short conversation with no material benefits exchanged about how aid is shared with the host communities in Uganda, as well as a perspective-taking exercise, which we know all about from Jean's presentation. And then we have a group in which these 2 treatments are layered. So the business owner receives the grant, and that's linked to this inclusive message. And that makes this shared aid policy both more credible and visible. And we find that all of these treatments increase support for inclusive policies, including the right to work for refugees and supporting Uganda in continuing to host. The largest effects we found were on this last group, the combination of the grant plus the information. Though we were also interested in economic outcomes like business profits and survival, we measured very few effects in these areas, and that could be potentially due to COVID and business closures and restrictions, as many of our interventions were started in early 2020. And the main takeaway from our study is that giving aid to the host community members, coupled with giving refugees access to the labor market, could help facilitate a transition from exclusionary and short-term humanitarian aid to long-term social and economic integration within the host society. As part of our study, we additionally had part of our sample randomized into a mentorship treatment. Well, I'm not going to spend too much time on this today. I just wanted to go through part of the study. So these were additional arms to test certain conditions of the contact hypothesis, whether contact with a refugee that was economically beneficial for a host community member could increase support for refugee inclusion. And so we followed the model of a study in Nairobi, Kenya, in which an experienced mentor is matched to a less experienced business owner in the same sector. And we assigned both refugees as mentors, taking advantage of this perception that refugees have expertise in certain sectors, as well as Ugandans as mentors. And all the mentees were our sample of Ugandan business owners. And in practice, this mentorship looked like weekly meetings in person where the 2 business owners would come together. But unfortunately, we had to suspend many of these interventions early on and resume later on over the phone a year later. Still, we found positive effects on support for inclusive policies, equivalent to some of our other groups, but lower than our main treatment, the cash and information. We also didn't measure effects on profit or other business outcomes from these interventions. As I said, today, we're not really going to go through this, but we have a more detailed description and results in the paper. So our study contributes to ongoing and active debates. The first literature we contribute to are these effects of economic aid programs on attitudes. And it pairs nicely with finding that Yang presented earlier in the conference that simply livelihoods programs that emphasize contact but without these explicit messages might not really change social cohesion. So in our study, we explicitly link aid with these inclusive messages. We also contribute to work on perspective taking, non-judgmental listening, and these other types of persuasion techniques to change people's attitudes towards migrants. And in addition to these techniques, we also add aid and material benefits. So now getting more into the details of our study, we choose the context of Uganda, which is the largest refugee hosting country in Africa, with 1.5 million refugees, mostly from Congo and South Sudan. And these are primarily hosted in remote settlements in the border. Refugees there are given generous rights, the freedom to move and settle where they wish, to work, and to start businesses. And as well in Uganda, 30% of refugee aid is to be shared with the host communities. And in the capital city, the context of our study, there are 100,000 refugees, but there are far fewer aid programs there, and knowledge about this aid sharing program is more limited. So our goal was to add this social cohesion message of inclusion on top of an effective livelihoods program. For this reason, we chose micro entrepreneurs as our sample. And this is a very common profession in Uganda, and also one in which many refugees participate in. So our sample consists of salons and tailors, and those are also industries where many refugees have businesses and hosts might feel crowded out. And choosing this population allows us to both study outcomes on economic outcomes on firms, as well as policy preferences and attitudes. And our sample consists of 1,406 inexperienced Ugandan business owners, and we drew these from a larger sample of over 3,400 firms from market dense and refugee dense areas across Kampala. And now I'm handing it over to Thomas.
Great, thank you so much, Olivia. So I'll pick this up on outlining our timeline here. So we started by launching the baseline in November of 2019, and then started our interventions in the early stage of 2020, which obviously in retrospect was not a great time to be launching an RCT. So at the time that we had to suspend because of COVID, we had distributed about 33% of these grants, and all of that work was in person. So then we were able to recontact our sample in November 2020 over the phone survey, and then relaunch the interventions at the beginning of 2021, but converting all of these interventions to phone discussions and mobile money. We recontacted everybody, including the people who had already received the grants, but only distributed a grant once to everybody in the arms that were getting cash. So then about 3 months after that second wave of interventions, we were able to do an in-person inline, and then we have plans to go back next month to do a longer term follow-up with the same population. Great. So zooming in on the program and exactly what we did, this information script was a bundle of different things. It was about 15 minutes long. One of those things was contact, but that's not the main part of what we're looking at. And so half of our enumerators were refugees, but half of them were Ugandans. So that's not kind of the full story of what's going on here with the information component. Part of what the information script was introduced the implementing partner here, which was a refugee-led organization. So the idea here was that by partnering with a refugee-led organization that was very visible in the community, that hosts would have a better idea of seeing kind of the contributions that refugees are making, and to make the kind of idea of this kind of aid sharing more salient. Then we went through these non-judgmental listening and perspective-taking exercises that, again, have shown promise in maybe not all contexts, but in some contexts before. And then the last component was explaining this policy that Uganda's had in place for a while, that 30% of assistance coming through the refugee response should go to the host communities. And so in the information script, we talked about some of the social services that this has contributed to. And in the treatment arm where they got cash directly, we connected this cash directly to this policy as a reason that this cash was flowing to them. And so the cash component of this project in 2020, 60% of the $140 at least was kind of in kind, where we would purchase business assets with the recipient in order to kind of be consistent with some of the literature on the flypaper effect, that it would stick to businesses better. But in 2021, given the need to transition to remote implementation, we just transferred the full amount via mobile money. Great, so a quick word on the design and the empirics. So for each of our treatment arms in the control, the sample size here is between 237 and 287. And across both waves of that implementation, we were implementing between 78 and 90% of take-up within each treatment arm. Then when we went to follow up with our sample, we achieved 77% follow-up on average, which we were thrilled about given the massive interruptions over COVID and over a long time period. The results that I'll show you here are intent to treat estimates. We use an ENCOVA specification with the double lasso method to select the controls. We asked these questions in terms of Likert scale, so a 5-point scale on whether you strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. And then for interpretation, we've converted these to binary outcomes. And then we also have measures that are summary indices that were pre-specified. In order to mitigate some concerns around multiple hypothesis testing, we also present the sharpened Q values in the paper. And again, everything that we're presenting here is pre-specified in our analysis plan. Great, so who are we working with here? Our sample is 68% women. They are on average 27 years old with 2 years of business experience. We were intentionally targeting inexperienced businesses in line with the mentorship arms of the study. And so on average, 2 years of business experience across the sample. They have about $40 US in monthly profit. And again, the cash component of the project was about 3.5 times this amount. And so looking at baseline attitudes towards the main part that we're interested in, 18% are aware of this kind of aid sharing between from the refugee response. So 18% in this context. And so thinking about baseline attitudes here, when we ask a very broad question around general support, 72% report receptivity and agreement with that Uganda should host refugees. When we start asking about more specific policies like accepting more refugees, the right to work, and freedom of movement, this falls to between 50 and 60%, which may be higher than in other contexts, but still leaves a fair amount of room for attitudes to shift. Great, so looking into our main results here. So the overarching message here is that we did find increased support for inclusive refugee policies. So looking at those different components that I just mentioned, so support, hosting, right to work, freedom of movement, and accepting more refugees here. In the first row is our cash and information treatment. And the way to interpret the first 4 columns is, again, in terms of percentage points. These are Likert variables that we asked converted to binary outcomes. And so this is a 14.6 percentage point increase in the likelihood of reporting agreement with supporting hosting. Similarly, a 13 percentage point increase in the right to work. We don't see anything on freedom of movement. We do see increased acceptance of more refugees coming. And then we aggregate these into a policy preference index that is, again, interpreted in terms of standard deviations and see a substantial effect. In the next set, next to the cash group, this is our cash only group, where we didn't make the kind of message explicit around the refugee component of where the assistance came from. But you can see that we also saw positive effects on support for hosting, on the right to work, and on our policy index overall. Now, this is statistically less than the cash and information group, but still really interesting. And we think that part of what's going on here is that respondents were familiar with our implementing partner who works with refugees and the host community, Yared. And so they were still aware that this cash came through the refugee response. And so that it's consistent with our mechanism, but less than the group that we made this fully explicit for. Similarly, on the information arm, we also see some positive effects, especially when you aggregate this up into our policy index. And again, kind of part of what's we believe going on here is these components around the kind of non-judgmental listening, potentially the information, but the bundle of treatments that we kind of packed into our 15-minute conversation. And so a little bit more evidence consistent with those mechanisms. So in the first column, this is again about whether they know that the international donations are shared with Ugandans. And again, we see a substantial increase in the cash and information group. We also see that increase in the cash group. And so we think this is kind of consistent with our mechanism. When we look at other outcomes, we also see positive effects on whether they think that the refugees have a positive effect on the Ugandan economy overall. Again, highest magnitude in the cash and information group. When we ask whether refugees have a positive effect on culture, we don't see very much. I mean, and you can kind of rationalize that by that not being a kind of major part of our message here. But we do see when we look at a social proximity index around whether you're willing to have a refugee as your neighbor, as even marry a refugee, we see substantial effects on the cash and information group that suggest there's still some kind of social component here that's moving alongside the other kind of economic margins of beliefs about refugees. Then again, kind of thinking about our broader framing here about kind of the political economy of assistance, we've looked at the satisfaction with your local politician, your members of parliament. These effects, we don't see statistically effects on members of parliament. We do see weekly statistically significant effects on your satisfaction with local politicians. And so an area to follow up on in future work. So again, the last part of what Olivia had framed in our general project here is looking at projects that we could add a social cohesion message onto effective livelihood programs was kind of our overall goal. And we were motivated by the large literature on cash grants to small businesses that largely finds positive substantial effects on small businesses. And so that's not what we are picking up here across kind of a range of economic outcomes, business survival, profit, total household income, and again, a kind of general index. So part of that explanation, again, might be the massive interruptions of COVID across this full sample, and that just kind of dwarfs any treatment effects here. But it's also consistent that some of the literature has found weaker effects among women-owned businesses. And given that 68% of our sample are women-owned businesses, that's potentially one explanation here. But those are the results, and hopefully that we can still find programs that would be consistent with moving economic and social margins jointly. Zooming in just a little bit more, when we look at heterogeneity of the treatment effects on inclusion, we find that this is stronger among those who are less supportive at baseline, which we think makes a lot of sense. Again, we think that part of this mechanism is just experience and familiarity with the refugee-led organization. Also, when we look at the mentorship component, we see even mentorship by Ugandans has shifted attitude towards refugees a little bit. And so again, we think that this is coming because people are familiar just with Yared's good work in the community more broadly, and that kind of makes them more receptive toward refugees, and just kind of a reason to partner with many of the refugee-led organizations that are doing fantastic work. One concern that we had going into this was around social desirability. So given that we've got this kind of campaign and a very clear message, that maybe our respondents just kind of want to reflect that back to us and feel that they don't want to disappoint us by kind of, not being as responsive, receptive toward refugees, especially after we've given them cash. And so we have a number of different things we do to try to look at this, and we find kind of not much evidence that this is a salient feature here. So we try to emphasize the independence of the survey firm. We have a donation behavioral measure that's consistent with our other findings. We have a survey experiment where we prime the respondents to think about the past assistance that they've received and don't find any effect on the reporting of attitudes. And we've got a few other measures that we're excited about in progress, in conjunction with our longer term follow-up that again is launching soon, fingers crossed. Great, and so just our kind of main takeaways here. So we think that aid to host communities, but especially with the right messaging, is a really promising avenue to more widely increase support for refugees' labor market access. And we see this kind of broadly as a potential tool to help achieve the noble aims of the Global Compact on refugees that was signed in 2018. And we see our project as kind of providing evidence that at the individual level, that host communities are willing to make the same bargain that their governments and countries have been promising on a national level, and for implementing partners that this is a way to kind of facilitate this, and a low-cost addition to many of the ongoing programs that work with refugees and host communities. And so, thinking about kind of the broader macro picture, it's not necessarily that aid to hosts would have to be additional in the long run. That we think about kind of greater labor market access, as we saw in Sandra's paper earlier, can facilitate greater self-reliance for displaced populations, especially in protracted situations, and reduce the need for lower return humanitarian aid like rations and camps in really remote areas, and kind of allow some of this assistance to be reallocated over time for donors who are forward-looking and willing to invest in social cohesion at the beginning of a kind of refugee event. And so finally, I'll put in a pitch here that we are interested in trying this in other contexts. And so organizations that might be interested in this, we hope you'll reach out. And thank you very much for the organizers and for listening. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Thomas and Olivia. Very interesting, and great that you were able to pull this off during this difficult times, especially for field work. Yes, let's see if there's some questions popping up in the chat.
Oh, we'd especially put a plug. If anyone's got any ideas, reach out. We're about to launch our second inline survey. So we'd love to hear from anybody that's got kind of additional outcomes or possible mechanisms that that they think would be interesting here. We're in the middle of designing that. So thanks again.
Hey, maybe just a quick question from my side then. Do you think the recipients, like the individual characteristics of the recipients, are important? Like, right, you chose a specific subset of the population. Would you think this would work for other subsets as well?
So, I mean, I'll start jumping in and answering that. I mean, I think you know, part of the reason that we chose this population was in the context of Uganda's aid sharing policy, which other countries are adapting. I know Jordan specifically has moved toward that, but not other countries necessarily. But we chose an area in Kampala where there were a substantial number of refugees, but where aid had not been kind of as consistent. So certainly it's a unique sample, as any kind of you know, work with you know, singular like randomized control trials would be. Again, we think that, you know, our sample of about 50% of people who kind of support these populations leave some kind of room for you know, attitudes to shift. So you know, I think that it's backed up in other contexts around the non-judgmental listening and the perspective taking to some extent. And so you know, I think we're optimistic that it could work in other contexts. We didn't, when we look at heterogeneity within our sample, we don't see any differences between like men and women or by baseline profits or anything like that. And so, you know, that suggests that this might be a more substantial feature, just targeting those people who might be more you know, kind of less receptive at baseline. But we don't kind of have any other evidence to suggest that it wouldn't work any other place, I guess is the best way that I could frame the answer there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe like a very related question was asked by Yang Yang Su. She asked whether you also try to run a program in rural hosting areas, especially in the Northwest, and whether you expect the results to be similar, or whether you think you would need to adapt the program somehow.
I can start with this question. I think in the rural areas or the settlement areas that have been hosting refugees for a long time, there's a lot more knowledge about these aid sharing programs, and host communities, as well as the local host governments there, have seen the tangible benefits. So we chose Kampala because it is one of the places in Uganda that has less of these programs and less messaging. I think part of the like harmonious relationship between refugees and host communities in Uganda could be in part because of the way this aid sharing has been implemented there in the rural settlements.
Thank you. Great. Perfect. I think we are right on time. Thank you very much again, Olivia and Thomas, and also thank you very much to all the other presenters, Sergey, Tivan, and Young. I think this was a very interesting session. We have a 15-minute break now where we can digest all the ideas and thoughts. And then we will move on to another keynote by Ana Maria Ibanez. So yeah, enjoy and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.